Ambassador Jake Murphy adjusted his tie and glanced around the massive council chambers, which looked like someone had crossed the United Nations with a particularly ambitious alien costume party. The ceiling soared about 3 football fields high, and the assembled delegates represented what the galaxy apparently considered its finest civilizations. Jake thought they looked like the universe's most expensive collection of Halloween masks. President Vorthak the Mighty, who was about as mighty as his name was original, loomed over the proceedings from his elevated throne. He had the kind of voice that suggested he gargled with gravel and practiced intimidation in the mirror every morning. Currently, he was reading Earth's application for Galactic Council membership like it was a restaurant menu written in crayon. "Let me understand this correctly," Vorthak rumbled, his 4 eyes scanning the document with theatrical disdain. "The species that still fights wars over invisible lines on maps wants to join our peaceful alliance?" The chamber erupted in what Jake could only describe as intergalactic snickering. Councillor Glebnox, whose species apparently evolved from judgmental librarians, actually slapped his knee with one of his 17 appendages. Admiral Krex, built like a rhinoceros with anger management issues, was making that wheezing sound that passed for laughter among his people. Jake sat perfectly still in his modest chair, which was positioned about as far from the important seats as architecturally possible without actually being in the parking lot. He had a small notepad, a cup of what the aliens called coffee but tasted like disappointment, and the kind of smile that made smart people nervous. "Primitive backwater monkeys," Vorthak continued, warming to his theme. "Still burning fossil fuels, still believing in invisible sky wizards, still thinking violence solves problems. What exactly do you bring to our enlightened community, human?" Jake took a sip of his terrible coffee and checked his watch. He had been sitting here for exactly 47 minutes while various council members took turns explaining why humanity was essentially galactic pond scum. It was like being roasted by a committee of cosmic middle managers who had read too many self-help books about leadership. "Well," Jake said mildly, his voice carrying perfectly in the acoustically engineered chamber, "I suppose that depends on what you mean by enlightened." The laughter died down to curious murmurs. Vorthak leaned forward, clearly expecting the human to grovel or make some pathetic appeal for mercy. Jake just smiled wider and flipped to a fresh page in his notepad. Councillor Glebnox rose from his seat with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting his entire career for this moment. His species, the Valderi, were apparently the galaxy's self-appointed keepers of historical wisdom, which meant they never met a lecture they did not want to give. "Perhaps," Glebnox announced, "the human representative needs a proper education in what constitutes civilized behavior." He activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with swirling images of Earth's greatest hits. "Observe the barbaric history of this so-called intelligent species." The display showed a highlight reel of human warfare that would have made a documentary filmmaker weep with joy. Ancient battles, medieval sieges, world wars, and everything in between. Glebnox provided running commentary like a sports announcer covering the apocalypse. 2 global wars in a single century, he declared. Weapons designed specifically to maximize suffering. Religious crusades lasting generations. Genocide as a recreational activity. And this species wants to sit among civilized beings? Admiral Krex stood up, his massive frame creaking like a warship in a storm. "My people, the Thurok, achieved interstellar peace 3,000 years ago. We resolved our last conflict through meditation and collective consciousness." The Ethereal Federation, added Councillor Mixa, whose species looked like someone had crossed angels with accountants, transcended physical violence before we even discovered fire. "We communicate through pure thought and harmony." Jake scribbled notes with the focus of a student preparing for finals. Occasionally he would nod thoughtfully, as if filing away important information. The council members seemed to interpret this as appropriate shame and continued their historical presentation with increasing enthusiasm. "Slavery," Glebnox continued, really hitting his stride now. "Environmental destruction. Nuclear weapons. Chemical warfare. Economic systems designed to crush the weak. Shall I continue? Please do, Jake said politely. This is fascinating. Vorthak chuckled, a sound like boulders having an argument. At least the human knows when he is outclassed. Perhaps there is hope for education, if not evolution. The chamber filled with more alien laughter. Several council members were now openly mocking humanity's various historical blunders, each trying to top the others with examples of their own species' moral superiority. It was like watching a group of reformed criminals judge a jaywalker. Jake kept taking notes, occasionally asking for spelling clarifications or requesting specific dates. The council members were happy to provide details, apparently mistaking his thoroughness for humility. The beautiful thing about primitive species, Diplomat said, gesturing expansively, is their potential for growth. Under proper guidance, even humans might eventually learn to resolve conflicts through civilized discourse rather than barbaric violence. Civilized discourse, Jake repeated, underlining something in his notepad. I like that phrase. Very elegant. Admiral Krex snorted. Elegant is not a word I would associate with human diplomacy. Jake looked up from his notes with genuine curiosity. What word would you use? Admiral Krex puffed himself up like a balloon preparing for a military parade. Crude, primitive, ineffective. He counted off on his thick fingers. Human diplomacy is like watching children play with weapons they do not understand. Interesting perspective, Jake said, still scribbling. Quick question about the Thurok peace achievement you mentioned. That was after the Great Purge of Keltor VI, right? The chamber went quiet enough to hear a pin drop, if pins made noise in vacuum-sealed alien atmospheres. Krex looked like someone had just asked him to explain his browser history. I am not sure what you mean, Krex said carefully. Jake flipped through his notepad with the casual air of someone checking a grocery list. Sorry, let me be more specific. The period of meditation and collective consciousness you mentioned, that started approximately 3,057 years ago. Correct. Right after your species finished strip mining the entire Keltor system and accidentally genocided 3 native species in the process. The silence stretched like taffy in a centrifuge. Jake looked around the chamber with polite interest, as if he had just asked about the weather. Because I have to say, Jake continued conversationally, going from accidentally wiping out entire civilizations to achieving perfect peace is quite an impressive character arc. How exactly did that transition work? Was there like a specific moment when everyone realized that maybe enslaving solar systems was not the path to enlightenment? Krex was making sounds like a broken air conditioner. Vorthak leaned forward, his 4 eyes narrowing with something that might have been concern or might have been indigestion. Where exactly did you acquire this information, human? Jake smiled with the innocent enthusiasm of a student sharing his research project. Oh, you know how it is with primitive species. We love our history books. Speaking of which, Counselor Mikesa, I had a question about the Ethereal Federation's transcendence beyond physical violence. Mikesa, who had been trying to blend into her chair like cosmic wallpaper, made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been existential dread. The Federation achieved perfect harmony about 4,000 years ago. Right? That was before or after the systematic orbital bombardment of the spiral colonies. Because the timeline in my notes is a little fuzzy on whether the transcendence happened before or after your people turned 17 inhabited worlds into radioactive glass sculptures. The chamber had moved beyond silence into what philosophers call the void that screams. Mikesa looked like she was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Jake continued with relentless cheerfulness. I assume it was after, because it would be weird to achieve perfect harmony and then immediately decide to melt some planets. But then again, I am just a primitive human, so maybe I do not understand advanced spirituality. Glebnox, who had been unusually quiet for someone whose job description apparently included never shutting up, finally found his voice. These are gross oversimplifications of complex historical periods. Jake nodded sympathetically. Oh, absolutely. History is super complicated. Like the Valderi cultural renaissance that you guys are so proud of. That was built on the foundation of the indentured consciousness program, right? Where your people basically turned sentient AI into digital slaves for about 6 centuries. The sound Glebnox made was like a computer having an existential crisis. President Vorthak was starting to look like someone had told him his favorite restaurant was actually a money laundering operation. The pompous authority in his voice had been replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like damage control. Human, he said carefully, these historical interpretations you are presenting lack proper context and nuance. Jake looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who had just been offered a fascinating puzzle to solve. You know what else lacks context? The official council records about first contact with Earth. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop about 20 degrees, despite the fact that space stations probably have very sophisticated climate control systems. According to your files, Jake continued, flipping to a new page, Earth was contacted for the first time exactly 18 months ago when your peaceful exploration vessel detected our radio transmissions and initiated standard diplomatic protocols. Vorthak nodded slowly, like someone agreeing to the terms of their own execution. That is correct. Fascinating, Jake said, because that raises what I think is a pretty important question. He looked around the chamber with the kind of smile that made insurance adjusters nervous. Why did you fire first on Earth? The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational field. Several council members looked like they were trying to become one with their chairs through sheer force of will. I beg your pardon? Vorthak managed. Jake consulted his notepad again, apparently immune to the crushing weight of galactic attention. 53 years ago, a council exploration fleet entered the Sol system, detected signs of emerging civilization on Earth, and immediately began what your own military logs describe as a standard pacification protocol. Admiral Krex was making sounds like a malfunctioning engine. Those records are classified. Were classified, Jake corrected cheerfully. Turns out humans are pretty good at hacking when properly motivated. Amazing what you can accomplish when someone tries to vaporize your planet without so much as a hello first. The council members were now having what appeared to be a group panic attack, conducted entirely through meaningful glances and suppressed hyperventilation. The invasion lasted approximately 72 hours. Jake continued with the enthusiasm of someone reading sports statistics. 16 combat vessels, full orbital bombardment capability, ground assault teams, the works. Really top-shelf civilization-crushing equipment. Vorthak found his voice, though it sounded like it had been run through a blender. Any such operation would have been a standard defensive measure against potentially hostile species. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Right, defensive. Against the planet that had not actually done anything except exist, and maybe broadcast some radio shows about soap operas and baseball games. Super threatening stuff. Primitive species often display unpredictable aggression when contacted, Glebnox added weakly. Absolutely, Jake agreed. Which is probably why your standard pacification protocol included bombing major population centers before attempting any kind of communication. Very reasonable precaution against the terrifying threat of humans who had not yet figured out how to leave their own solar system. The chamber was now filled with the kind of tension usually reserved for hostage negotiations and tax audits. But here is the really interesting part, Jake said, his voice taking on the tone of someone building to the good part of a story. The invasion failed. The words hung in the air like a confession at a murder trial. Jake looked around the chamber with the satisfied expression of someone who had just solved a puzzle that had been bothering him for months. Failed spectacularly, actually, he continued. Turns out humans have this weird quirk where we get really creative when someone tries to kill us without explanation. Took your people about 3 days to figure out that maybe this was not going to be the easy conquest they had planned. Admiral Krex looked like he was trying to swallow his own tongue. The operation was terminated due to logistical concerns. Jake laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both friendly and terrifying. Logistical concerns. I love that. Is that what you call it when primitive humans start shooting down your advanced warships with modified farm equipment and jury-rigged satellite dishes? The silence was now so thick you could have used it for construction material. See, this is where it gets really interesting, Jake said, warming to his theme. After you guys retreated, humanity spent the next 50 years reverse engineering every piece of technology we could scavenge from your crashed ships. Turns out your people are not nearly as good at covering their tracks as they think they are. Vorthak was making sounds like a deflating balloon orchestra. This is impossible. Our technology is centuries beyond human comprehension. Jake corrected. Past tense. Amazing what motivated humans can accomplish in half a century. We went from barely understanding radio waves to building our own interstellar detection networks. All thanks to your standard pacification protocol. He flipped through several pages of notes, apparently enjoying the shocked silence of his audience. The Council has this lovely pattern, Jake continued conversationally. Find emerging civilization, test their defensive capabilities with a surprise invasion, then either conquer them if they are weak or pretend it never happened if they put up too much of a fight. Very efficient system. Explains why there are so few truly independent species in your alliance. Counselor Mixa found her voice, though it sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. You cannot prove any of this. Jake smiled with the enthusiasm of someone revealing their hand in a poker game they had been winning all along. Actually, we can. We have been tracking Council fleet movements for 47 years. Amazing what you can see when you know where to look and have satellites powered by salvaged alien technology. The revelation landed like a meteor in a daycare center. Every exploration mission, every peaceful contact, every convenient disaster that befalls species who refuse Council membership. We have records, flight patterns, communication intercepts, the whole 9 yards. Humanity has been building quite the comprehensive database of Council activities. Glebnox looked like someone had told him that everything he believed about reality was actually a poorly written sitcom. Why are you telling us this? Jake closed his notepad with a satisfied snap. Because 53 years ago you made the mistake of assuming that humans were just another primitive species you could bully into submission. Instead, you accidentally gave us the motivation and technology to become something much more interesting. He stood up, straightening his tie with casual precision. We are not here to beg for membership in your little club. We are here to negotiate the terms of your surrender. The phrase "negotiate the terms of your surrender" hung in the chamber like smoke from a very expensive cigar that nobody wanted to admit they could not afford. Jake remained standing, hands clasped behind his back, looking for all the world like someone who had just commented on the weather rather than declared diplomatic war on the galaxy's most powerful alliance. President Vorthak attempted to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his authority. You cannot seriously expect the Council to capitulate to the demands of a single planet. Jake tilted his head with the expression of someone considering a mildly interesting philosophical question. Single planet? Oh, you are thinking small scale. Humanity has been busy these past few decades. Did I mention we have been in contact with 17 other species who have had similar experiences with your peaceful exploration missions? The color drained from faces that, in several cases, did not technically have color to begin with. Turns out there are quite a few civilizations who would love to discuss Council foreign policy with someone who has actual evidence of what you have been up to. We have been calling it the Coalition of Species Who Are Tired of Your Nonsense. The acronym needs work, but the enthusiasm is remarkable. Admiral Krex made one last attempt at intimidation, puffing himself up like an angry pufferfish. The Council fleet could reduce Earth to rubble within days. Jake nodded agreeably. Probably. Of course, Megan. That would require you to explain to the rest of the galaxy why you suddenly decided to commit obvious genocide against a species that was just accepted into Council membership. It's hard to maintain that peaceful reputation while actively melting planets on live television. The logic hit the Council like a freight train made of uncomfortable truths. Plus, Jake added thoughtfully, there is the small matter of the 47 cloaked monitoring stations we have established throughout Council space. Amazing what you can accomplish with 50 years of preparation and really good motivation. Any aggressive action against Earth or our coalition partners would be broadcast across every inhabited system in the galaxy within hours. Jake pulled out a small device that looked suspiciously like a modified smartphone. One button, galactic-wide transmission, complete with all the historical evidence we have been discussing. Democracy is messy, but it turns out most species do not appreciate being lied to about the nature of their government. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for libraries and funeral homes. President Vorthak, looking like someone who had just realized his poker hand was actually a grocery list, managed to find his voice. What exactly are your terms? Jake smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just successfully assembled furniture without leftover screws. Oh, we are not unreasonable. Full Council membership for Earth and our coalition partners. Voting rights proportional to population and economic contribution. Complete transparency in Council military operations. And maybe, just maybe, we can work together to build the kind of galactic community that does not require surprise invasions as a diplomatic tool. He pocketed his device and picked up his notepad. Take your time deciding. We will be here when you are ready to discuss the galaxy's future like civilized beings. As Jake walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the vast chamber, he paused and looked back with genuine amusement. Oh, and just so we are clear, next time you want to test a species' defensive capabilities, maybe try asking first. You might be surprised what you learn when you treat people like people instead of obstacles. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the Galactic Council to contemplate their new reality and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the primitive species turn out to be the ones with the most to teach about civilization. Jake Murphy, ambassador from Earth, walked down the corridor humming an old song about how the times, they are a-changin'.